Information from the eye passes through a bottleneck before it reaches the brain's visual cortex, which then heavily processes the sparse signal. Mathematicians and neuroscientists have recently developed the very first anatomically refined model that explains how vision is possible, as this has been the great mystery of human vision. Whilst vivid pictures of the world appear before our mind's eye, our brain's visual system receives very little information from the world itself. Much of what we see, we incredibly conjure in our heads. It is known by scientists that much of the things we think we see, we are actually making up. We don't actually see them, and yet the brain is doing a pretty good job of inventing the visual world, since we don't routinely bump into doors or trip over things. Unfortunately, studying anatomy alone does not reveal how the brain makes these images up any more than staring at a car engine would allow you to decipher the laws of thermodynamics. But most recent research seems to suggest that mathematics is the key, as over the past few years a select group in New York have been working on developing a specific mathematical model that unifies many years of biological experiments and helps to explain just how the brain is able to produce elaborate visual reproductions of the world based on rather basic visual information. This elite group have been building their model by incorporating one basic element of vision at a time. They have explained how neurons in the visual cortex interact to detect the edges of objects and changes in contrast, and are now working on an explanation as to how the brain perceives the direction in which objects are moving. Previous efforts to model human vision made wishful assumptions about the architecture of the visual cortex, given the existing unintuitive biology of the visual cortex, and yet the phenomenon of vision still being possible. The eye acts as a lens. It receives light from the outside world and projects a scale replica of our visual field onto the retina, which is situated at the back of the eye. The retina is connected to the visual cortex, the part of the brain in the back of the head. However, there is very little connectivity between the retina and the visual cortex. For a visual area roughly 1/4 the size of a full moon, there are only about 10 nerve cells connecting the retina to the visual cortex. These cells make up the LGN, or lateral genicular nucleus, the only pathway through which visual information travels from the outside world into the brain. Not only are LGN cells few in number, but they cannot do much either. LGN cells send a pulse to the visual cortex when they detect a change from dark to light, or vice versa, in their tiny section of the visual field, and that is pretty much it. The lighted world bombards the retina with data, but all the brain has to go on is the tiny signalling from a tiny collection of LGN cells. To see the world based on so little information is like trying to construct a blue whale from notes on a napkin. Whilst we may believe that the brain is taking a photograph of what we see in our visual field, the brain does not take a picture, the retina does, and this information passing from the retina to the visual cortex is sparse. It is then that the visual cortex goes to work. While the cortex and the retina are connected by relatively few neurons, the cortex itself is dense with nerve cells. For every 10 LGN neurons that snake back from the retina, there are 4,000 neurons in just the initial input layer of the visual cortex, and many more in the rest of it. This discrepancy suggests that the brain heavily processes the little visual data it does receive. So, scientists have summed up that the visual cortex almost has a mind of its own.